Doc, you need to see this." The soldier's voice cracked, not from cold, from something worse. 11 minutes she'd been buried under that avalanche. 11 minutes of snow crushing the air out of her lungs after she'd put 2 impossible rounds downrange and saved an entire SEAL team from a kill zone they never should have walked out of. Now she was on a cot in a field medical tent, half frozen, and a combat doctor with 11 years of war behind her was staring at Sloane Reeves' ribs like she'd just seen a ghost. "That's not possible," the doctor whispered. "What isn't?" Sloane rasped. Nobody answered. A phone light swept across her side numbers, a shape, ink gone silver with age. "Command, this is Doc Alvarez. Pull every file you have on Project Nightwatch. 10 minutes. "Doc," the radio came back. "Nightwatch was terminated 15 years ago. There is no file."
The mountain does not forgive mistakes. Sloane Reeves learned that before she learned to read, learned it the way other children learn nursery rhymes, learned it from a man who no longer had a name the government would admit to. Her father, Colonel Daniel Reeves, or what was left of him in her memory now. A voice, a set of hands correcting her grip on a rifle stock, a silhouette against firelight, always facing the door. She was 27 years old now, 5'3" in boots, built small and wiry in the way mountain winners build a body all lean muscle and no wasted motion. Dark hair cropped short enough to stay out of a scope's eye relief. Gray eyes that had learned a long time ago to hold perfectly still while everything around them moved. Strangers who passed through the valley sometimes called her pretty, in the careful, surprised way people use the word when they weren't expecting to find beauty somewhere, this remote, this guarded. She never gave the compliment much room to land. Pretty wasn't a survival skill. Her father had taught her plenty of those, and that particular one had never made the list. 15 years since he stopped coming home. 15 years of a birthday card that never arrived, of a phone that used to ring at strange hours and then simply didn't anymore. Of neighbors down in the valley who stopped asking about him because the not knowing had become its own kind of answer. She was 12 when 2 men in dress uniforms walked up the porch steps of a house she no longer lived in. 12 when her mother, already gone 2 years by then, to a car accident that had nothing to do with any war, wasn't there to catch her when the floor of the world tilted sideways. There'd been an aunt, a distant one, kind enough, not equipped for a girl who flinched at sudden noises and field-stripped a rifle faster than she could finish long division, so Sloane raised herself mostly. On the stories he'd left behind, on training that had already become instinct by the time he disappeared for the last time, on a mountain that didn't ask questions and didn't expect answers and let her vanish into it the way some people vanish into work or drink or grief that never quite finishes arriving. She built the cabin herself. Well, rebuilt it. The bones of it had been her father's, a hunting camp from before she was born, half collapsed by the time she came back to it at 19 with nothing but a truck full of tools and a refusal to be anywhere people could find her. 5 years of work, notched logs, a wood stove hauled up switchbacks that shouldn't have allowed it, a roofline steep enough to shed snow instead of hoarding it, a home built by someone who'd stopped believing homes were safe, constructed with the exact precision of someone determined to make this one different. The cabin sits at 7,000 feet in the Bitterroot Range, wedged between 2 ridgelines like a secret the mountain agreed to keep. No road reaches it in winter, no neighbor closer than 11 miles. Just pine, just stone, just the wind which never stops talking even when there's nothing left to say. Sloane split wood at dawn, same as every dawn. Swing, crack, stack. The rhythm of it lived in her shoulders now, permanent as a scar. Steam rose off her skin into 30-degree air, because that's what a body does when it works hard enough to forget itself. Which was the whole point. Forgetting. Except she never actually forgot anything, not really. She just got better at outrunning it. The rifle leaned against the porch post where it always leaned. A Remington, older than she was, refinished twice, the stock reshaped to fit hands smaller than the ones that first held it. Her father's hands, then hers. He used to say a rifle should fit like a promise. She never understood that sentence until the year he died. and then she understood it too well. Inside the cabin smelled like wood smoke and gun oil and the particular silence of a place built for one person who used to be two. She kept his dog tags on a nail by the door, not around her neck, never around her neck. Because a woman who wears her father's dog tags every day is a woman still waiting for him to come back, and Sloane had promised herself somewhere around year 3 of this life that she was done waiting. She touched them anyway, every morning, just once. Habit dressed up as ritual, or maybe the other way around. The locals down in the valley, the few who knew she existed at all, called her the Mountain Woman. Said it with a kind of respect that had curiosity folded inside it, the way people talk about someone whose story they've heard 3 different versions of and have stopped trying to reconcile. A hermit, a widow, some guessed, though she'd never been married. A woman running from something, most agreed, though nobody down there had the first idea what. They weren't wrong. She just wasn't running from what they thought. There was a photograph on the mantel curling at the edges from years of wood stove heat. Her father, in dress blues, younger than she was now, arm around a woman who laughed with her whole face. Her mother, gone in a different war entirely, the quiet kind. The kind that happens on a wet road at 11 at night with no witnesses and no medals and no folded flag. Sloane didn't look at the photograph often. Today she did. She wasn't sure why. Maybe the silence outside had already started rearranging something in her, some old alarm system that knew the day was going to demand things of her long before her conscious mind caught up. She made coffee, black. No sugar, because sugar was a comfort, and comfort was something she'd stopped trusting a long time ago. She stood at the window with the mug burning her palms and watched the tree line the way her father taught her to watch it. Not staring, scanning. Left to right, low to high, waiting for the shape that didn't belong. She remembered him teaching her this. Actually teaching it, not just modeling it, the way he modeled most things and expected her to absorb it through proximity. She'd been 9, maybe 10, crouched beside him at this same window in a version of this cabin that still had a hole in the roof he hadn't patched yet. The eye gets lazy if you let it, he'd told her, one hand resting light on her shoulder. It wants to look at the whole picture at once. Don't let it. Break the world into pieces. Look at each piece like it's the only one that matters. That's how you catch what everyone else misses. She'd asked him in the particular blunt way of children whether he was scared. Out there, wherever out there was, back before she understood that the answer to that question would always be classified. He'd been quiet a long moment, long enough that she'd thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Every single time he finally said, "Anyone who tells you they're not lying to you or lying to themselves." The scared doesn't go away, Sloane. You just get better at making it useful. She hadn't understood that answer at 10 years old. She understood it perfectly now, standing at the same window 15 years later, coffee cooling in her hands, while some old buried part of her prepared for a threat she couldn't yet name. Nothing moved. Good. She almost believed the day would be ordinary. She should have known better. Ordinary days don't announce themselves with silence this complete. This mountain had a sound always wind through needles, snow melt under ice, some small animal negotiating with the cold. Today, it had none of that. Today, the silence had a texture thick and waiting, like the whole valley was holding its breath before something exhaled it back out. By noon, the sky had gone the color of a bruise. She checked the radio out of habit more than hope. Static rolled through the little speaker, the kind of static that meant weather, real weather, the kind that killed people who thought they knew these mountains better than they did. She logged it anyway, old habits, her father's habits, worn into her like grooves in stone. She ate lunch, standing up, watched the window while she chewed, told herself, the way she told herself most days, that the watching was just discipline. Just something to keep the hands and the mind busy so neither one wandered somewhere she didn't want to go. Except discipline doesn't usually come with a pulse hammering under it. Discipline doesn't make the back of your neck prickle for no reason at all. She set the plate down, half finished. That's when she heard it. Not wind, not snow shifting on the roof, something underneath those sounds, a rhythm that didn't belong to the mountain. Footsteps, maybe. Or something worse. She set the coffee down without looking, muscle memory carrying her hand to the rifle before her mind finished the thought. Because a body remembers faster than a brain can catch up. She was at the window in 4 steps. Rifle up, breath slow, the way he taught her. In through the nose, hold, let it go halfway out and freeze there right at the edge of stillness, right where a shot lives. Movement. Far ridge, maybe 600 yards. Hard to tell with the light doing what winter light does, bending everything, lying about, distance. Men. Not hikers. Hikers don't move like that. Don't spread into formation without thinking about it. Don't carry rifles slung the way these men carried theirs, ready, low, disciplined. She counted 6, then a 7th, trailing, favoring his left leg like it had recently disagreed with him. 2 others trailed behind the group entirely, moving slower, hauling something heavy between them on a makeshift sled lashed together from what looked like tarp and rope. Cargo of some kind. Whatever it was, it mattered enough to drag through a blizzard instead of leaving behind. Her stomach dropped, because 6 armed men moving tactical through a blizzard in the middle of nowhere, Montana, meant exactly one of 2 things. Either they were running from something, or they were hunting it. She watched, waited, told herself this wasn't her problem, this wasn't her mountain to defend. She'd built a life up here specifically so other people's wars couldn't find her anymore. Which was a lie, and she knew it was a lie even while she was telling it to herself. Because she'd already counted their formation, already clocked the wounded man's position relative to cover, already started doing the math her father drilled into her before she'd even understood what the math was for. You don't get to unlearn a war just because you moved to a mountain, she thought. It just goes quiet. Waits. Except the mountain had other plans. The muzzle flash came before the sound did, a half-second lag, just enough time for her whole body to understand what was happening before her ears confirmed it. Gunfire cracking off the rock face, rolling down through the trees like something alive. The 7 men scattered. 2 went down hard. The others returned fire toward a tree line she couldn't see from her angle, couldn't see the shooters, could only see her father's old warning lighting up behind her eyes like a flare. Never engage what you can't see. Never move toward the noise. She moved toward the noise. Because one of the fallen men was still crawling, dragging himself behind a boulder with the kind of effort that meant he was almost out of effort completely. And something in her something she thought she'd buried along with her father 15 years ago refused to watch a man die on her mountain without at least trying. She grabbed the rifle, grabbed the pack by the door, the one she kept stocked for exactly this kind of unreasonable emergency, the one her father used to call her paranoia and she used to call preparation, grabbed her coat and ran. Snow to her knees, wind fighting her at every step, shoving her sideways like it had opinions about where she was headed. Her lungs burned, her thighs burned. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a calm, flat voice, her father's voice, ran the calculations she needed. 600 yards, elevation change maybe 40 feet. Wind gusting, unpredictable, 15 to 25 coming off the ridge at an angle that would push any shot she took hard to the left. Branches whipped her face. A root nearly took her down at the halfway mark, and she caught herself on a boulder slick with new ice palms splitting open on the stone. Not that she noticed the pain, yet not that pain mattered right now. Gunfire kept cracking somewhere ahead, steady, patient, the sound of men who had ammunition to spare and time to use it carefully. She thought of her father's voice again, older this time, further back, a memory instead of an instinct. 8 years old, lying beside him on a ridge not unlike this one, his hand flat against her back to keep her still. Fear's not the problem, Sloane, he'd told her. Fear keeps you alive. The problem is letting it drive. She wasn't letting it drive. Not yet. She found a shelf of rock 200 yards out and dropped into position without deciding to. Just did it. Bipod down, cheek to stock, eye to scope. Her heart wouldn't slow down. She let it race anyway, the way he'd taught her. Don't fight the heartbeat, work around it. Find the pause between beats and live there for the half-second that matters. The scene resolved, fast and ugly. 6 men, not 7, one of the fallen already gone, still in a way that told her everything. 5 left, pinned behind whatever cover the terrain offered, which wasn't much. Rock outcrops and snowdrift and a stand of lodgepole pine that wouldn't stop anything heavier than an insult. Muzzle flashes stitched the far tree line, coming from at least 3 positions. Coordinated, professional. Whoever these men were running from, they weren't running from amateurs. She found the nearest shooter through the scope, a man in white winter camo, prone rifle, rock still, unhurried. The kind of patience that only comes from training, from repetition, from a career built on exactly this moment. Her finger found the trigger guard, not the trigger. Not yet, because this was the line. She knew it the second she got there. Once she crossed it, there was no walking it back. She could turn around right now, go home, lock the door, let the mountain and the war on it settle whatever business it had settled without her. Except one of the men below, the one bleeding out from a hit to the shoulder, had just looked up, right at her position, right at the exact rock shelf she was lying on, like some part of him sensed rescue before it arrived. His face, even at this distance, even through snow and wind and 200 yards of nothing, looked like every soldier her father ever brought home. Broken, young, scared underneath the training, trying so hard not to be scared that it made the fear worse. And she thought, absurd, unbidden, that could have been me. If things had gone differently, if a car hadn't slid off a wet road, if a compound overseas had let one man walk out of it instead of keeping him, that could have been her down there in the snow, bleeding, looking up at a stranger on a ridge and hoping. Which decided it? Because it was never really a question. Not once she saw his face. She exhaled halfway and squeezed. The recoil rolled through her shoulder like an old friend returning uninvited. Downrange, the man in white camo folded sideways and didn't move again. She was already cycling the bolt, already finding the next target, already doing the math on wind and drop and angle before her conscious mind caught up to what her hands were doing. Second shot. Second man down. The remaining shooters broke position, scrambling for better cover, suddenly aware their flank had opened up from an angle they hadn't accounted for. That confusion bought the 5 survivors below exactly the window they needed. She watched them move, dragging their wounded, using terrain the way trained men use terrain, methodical, even in crisis. One of them, the one in the lead, kept glancing up toward her ridge between bursts of covering fire, trying to place the shooter, trying to figure out whether they'd just gained a friendly or another problem. She would learn his name later, Beckett Cole. Right now, he was just a shape in white and gray, dragging a wounded man twice his size through snow that fought him for every step. She fired twice more. Suppression, not kills, just enough to keep heads down while the survivors made their retreat toward better ground. Her barrel had gone hot enough that she could feel it through her gloves. Her hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the second shot, the way they always did once the work started, once thinking gave way to doing. Then the mountain answered her, a sound she felt in her teeth before she heard it. Low, enormous. The kind of sound that doesn't belong to any single direction because it comes from everywhere at once. She knew what it was half a second before her body understood the danger, and by the time understanding caught up, it was already too late to do anything but move. Avalanche. The whole face of the ridge above her let go at once, a slow-motion collapse that somehow still outran her, a wall of white, swallowing the tree line, the rock outcrops, the men she'd just saved. Everything. She ran. Because running was the only verb left, because her father's voice was screaming in her skull, "Run, downhill, get out of the path," and her legs obeyed before her brain finished processing the order. She didn't make it. The snow hit her like a wall made of ocean, like the whole sky had decided to become weight, and it took her legs out from under her and rolled her, and there was no up, no down, just cold and dark, and the terrible crushing patience of a mountain that had been waiting 15 years to finish what it started with her father. her mouth filled with snow. Her lungs screamed for air that wasn't there. Somewhere in the tumbling dark, a rational, distant part of her mind, the part her father had built brick by brick over years of training, tried to remember the rule. Make a pocket. Cup your hands over your face before the snow sets. Fight for an air pocket before you lose the strength to fight at all. Her arms wouldn't listen. Her body had become something the mountain was doing to her rather than something she still controlled. She thought absurdly in the half-second before the world went black. He never fell. Not once, not in 20 years of service, and here I am, falling. Then nothing, not sleep, not quite death, some gray country in between where time stopped meaning anything and cold became the only remaining sense. The sound came back before the light did. Voices, distorted, underwater, wrong somehow, like she was hearing them through a wall that used to be part of her skull. Someone shouting a name that wasn't hers, then a name that was. Reeves. Reeves, can you hear me? Somewhere further off, a different voice, rougher-edged with something close to panic, held on a very short leash. Her lips are blue, Cole. Her lips are blue, and I need everyone who isn't helping to get out of my tent right now. Reeves. Reeves, can you hear me? She couldn't answer, couldn't find the part of herself responsible for answering. Somewhere, far away, hands were moving across her body with the brisk, practiced urgency of people who'd done this before, people who knew exactly how much time a body has once the cold gets deep enough to stop asking permission. Pupils reactive, pulse thready but present. Get her core temp up now, we don't have time to wait on this. She tried to open her eyes and the world arrived in fragments. White ceiling, fluorescent light too bright, too clinical for a mountain that hadn't seen electricity in decades. Which meant she wasn't on the mountain anymore. Which meant someone had found her. They'd dug her out with their bare hands, though she wouldn't learn that until later. 4 men, half of them wounded, themselves working a search pattern through debris that could have buried them all a second time if the slope let go again. Cole had found her boot first, then the rest of her, 11 minutes, under blue-lipped and barely breathing close enough to gone that the medic who found her, Pulse, said a silent prayer before he said anything else. A face swam into focus above her. Young, male, green eyes gone wide with something that wasn't quite panic but lived right next door to it. Blood on his collar that wasn't his, days of exhaustion carved into features that should have belonged to someone older. "You're the one who fired those shots," he said, not a question. She tried to speak. Her throat produced nothing but a dry rasp. "Don't talk," he said, "just God. You saved my team. You do understand that. You saved every one of us, and then the mountain tried to bury you for it." She wanted to tell him that was mountains for you, ungrateful. But her body wasn't interested in jokes right now. Her body was interested in surviving the next 30 seconds, and every one after that. He reached for her jacket, unzipping it with clinical speed, checking for injuries her frozen skin couldn't yet report. And that's when his hands stopped. Just stopped. Right over her ribs where the fabric of her thermal shirt had ridden up during the extraction, exposing a strip of skin along her side that no one outside her own mirror had seen in 15 years. His whole body went still. "What?" she managed, barely a whisper. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away, and that silence, that specific kind of silence, the kind that arrives right before someone's whole understanding of a situation rearranges itself, scared her more than the avalanche had. He called over his shoulder, voice gone strange and tight. Doc, you need to see this." Another face appeared. Older, a woman, maybe 50 silver, threading through dark hair pulled back tight, the kind of face that had seen enough trauma to stop reacting to it visibly. Except she reacted to this. Dr. Renata Alvarez had spent 11 years patching up men in places that didn't officially exist on missions nobody would ever write a report about. She'd seen gunshot wounds, burns, frostbite that ate fingers down to the second knuckle. She'd learned a long time ago to keep her face still, no matter what her hands found underneath a torn uniform. Sloane watched that professional stillness fail in real time. watched the older woman's eyes go to her ribs, watched them widen, watched the color drain out of a face that had presumably watched men die and kept working anyway. "That's not possible," the woman said, quietly, like she was talking to herself and not to anyone in the tent. "What isn't?" Sloane whispered. The woman looked up, met her eyes for the first time since Sloane regained consciousness, and there was something in that look that Sloane had never seen directed at her before. Not concern, not curiosity, recognition. The kind of recognition that meant she'd seen this exact mark before, somewhere, on someone, in some report she was never supposed to remember the details of. Sloane watched her weigh something behind her eyes, some calculation about how much to say out loud in a tent with 2 other soldiers listening. "Where did you get this?" the woman asked. Her voice had gone very careful, very controlled, the voice people use when they're trying not to spook something that might bolt. Get what Sloane said. The young soldier, the one with the green eyes, turned his phone toward her, the flashlight app throwing hard white light across her exposed ribs, and there, in ink gone slightly silver with age, was a design she had looked at exactly once in the last 15 years and told herself every single time since that it meant nothing. A series of numbers, a geometric shape wrapped around them, angular, deliberate, nothing like the tattoos people got on a whim in their 20s. This had been placed with intention, with purpose, by someone who understood exactly what those numbers meant, even if the girl wearing them never had. "I don't know," Sloane whispered, and it was almost true. "I don't remember getting it." The doctor's hand trembled just slightly as she reached for the radio clipped to her vest. "Say that again," she said, slower this time. "I was 11, Sloane said. The memory arrived in pieces, cold and disjointed, the way memories do when you've spent 15 years actively not looking at them. "My father, he took me somewhere, some kind of clinic, told me it was a vaccination." "It wasn't a vaccination," the doctor said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. "I know that now," Sloane said. The tent had gone very quiet. Outside she could hear the low murmur of a camp waking up to something it didn't understand, yet engines idling, voices low and urgent, the particular tension of soldiers who sense a mission has just changed shape without anyone telling them why. The doctor keyed her radio. Her voice, when it came out, was flat in the specific way people go flat when they're trying very hard not to sound like they're panicking. "Command, this is Doc Alvarez. I need you to pull every file you have on Project Nightwatch, and I need you to do it in the next 10 minutes. There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that Sloane could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the cold still living in her bones despite the thermal blankets, despite the space heater roaring in the corner of the medical tent. "Say again?" the radio crackled back. "Nightwatch was terminated 15 years ago. There is no file." "There's a girl in my tent with a Nightwatch identifier tattooed on her ribs," Alvarez said, and her eyes never left Sloane's face while she said it. "So either somebody's lying to me or somebody's been lying to everybody for a very long time." Silence answered her, the kind of silence that meant someone on the other end of that radio had just felt the floor tilt underneath them. "Doc," the voice finally came back, quieter now, careful in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds earlier. "Do not discuss this over open radio. Do not let her out of your sight. Someone will be there within the hour." "An hour?" Alvarez repeated. "In this weather?" "Someone will be there within the hour," the voice said again, flatter this time, and the line went dead before Alvarez could argue with it. She clipped the radio back to her vest with hands that weren't quite steady, looked down at Sloane like she was seeing an entirely different person than the one they'd pulled out of the snow 2 hours ago. "Who are you?" Alvarez said quietly, not accusing, almost pleading. "I don't know anymore," Sloane said, and for the first time in 15 years, that felt truer than anything she'd told herself while chopping wood alone on a mountain that no longer felt like enough of a hiding place. Sloane lay there wrapped in blankets that couldn't quite reach the cold at the center of her, and understood with sudden, sickening clarity that the mountain hadn't just tried to bury a stranger who happened to save some soldiers. It had tried to bury a secret her father died protecting. And it had failed. They kept her in the medical tent through the night, watched, monitored, treated with the careful, distant politeness of people who no longer knew whether she was a patient or a problem. Nobody explained anything. Nobody sat down and told her what Project Nightwatch was, or why a 15-year-old secret was suddenly worth waking up a chain of command in the middle of a blizzard. They just watched her, checked her pupils every 20 minutes, spoke to each other in low voices just outside the tent flap, voices she could almost make out, and never quite could, which was somehow worse than silence. She lay there, running through everything she remembered about that day at the clinic. 11 years old, her father's hand tight around hers in a waiting room with no windows. A woman in a white coat who never gave her name. A needle that hurt more than any vaccination had any business hurting, and afterward a sting along her ribs that her father told her was just a bruise from how she'd flinched. He lied to me, she thought. Even then, even before everything else, he was already lying to me to keep me safe. The thought should have made her angry. Instead, it just made her tired, the specific exhaustion of finally understanding a puzzle she'd spent 15 years too afraid to look at directly. The young soldier came back around midnight, when the camp had gone quiet except for the generator's steady hum and the wind testing the canvas walls like it was looking for weakness. "Lieutenant Beckett Cole," he said, extending a hand she didn't have the strength to shake properly.
"That's who I am, in case nobody bothered with introductions while they were busy losing their minds over your ribs."
She managed something close to a smile. Small victory.
"You're welcome," she said, "for the whole not dying thing."
He laughed short and surprised, like laughter wasn't a thing he'd expected to do tonight. Then it faded fast, replaced by something heavier, something that had clearly been sitting on his chest since the moment the snow let go of the mountain.
"We lost 2 men today," he said. "Would have lost the whole team if you hadn't been up there. I keep running the numbers in my head, 6 of us, 3 shooters with a clean angle. We don't walk away from that. Not without you."
She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he seemed to understand that silence was its own kind of answer.
"Yeah, about that,"
he went on, voice sliding toward something almost businesslike, like work was easier ground than gratitude.
"You want to explain how a woman living alone on a mountain puts 2 rounds on target at 600 yards through crosswind and blowing snow?"
"Because my spotter couldn't have made those shots, and he's supposed to be the best we've got."
"My father taught me," she said.
"Your father sounds like he should be running training programs for the entire team's community," Cole said.
"He used to," Sloane said. And something in her voice made Cole go quiet, made him look at her the way people look at something they've just realized is more fragile than it appears, or maybe less fragile, maybe something they've badly underestimated.
"Used to," Cole repeated.
"He died," Sloane said, 15 years ago.
Nobody ever told me how, or where, just that it happened somewhere the government wasn't going to talk about. I stopped asking questions when I was 17 because asking questions never got me anything but more silence. Cole didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up again, throwing snow against the tent in soft rhythmic waves.
Something in his expression had shifted while she talked, something careful. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, almost like a man bracing for a name before he'd even heard it.
"What was his name?" Cole asked finally.
Quiet, careful, like the question itself might detonate something.
"Daniel Reeves," she said. "Colonel Daniel Reeves." She watched the name land on him, watched his face do something complicated, recognition and disbelief, and something that looked almost like grief, arriving 15 years late to a funeral it never got to attend.
"That's not possible," Cole said.
Quietly. The second time tonight someone had said those exact words to her.
"Why does everyone keep saying that?"
Sloane said, and her voice cracked on the last word. Cracked from cold and exhaustion and 15 years of nobody ever saying her father's name out loud in front of her like it mattered. Because Cole said, and he had to actually stop and collect himself before he could finish the sentence. Because Colonel Daniel Reeves is the reason I'm alive right now.
He pulled me out of a compound in an op that never officially happened on a date that doesn't exist in any record I've ever been allowed to see. I was 22 years old, and I owe that man my entire career, my entire life. Sloane felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept sealed for 15 years, sealed so tight she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't there anymore. "Then you knew him," she whispered. "Better than I did, probably. I only knew the version that came home between missions." Tired, distracted, already halfway back to wherever he'd just been. "That wasn't him being distant," Cole said. "That was him trying to leave the war outside the door so it didn't get on you. I watched him do it for other men's kids, too. He was good at building walls, better than anyone I ever served with." "He wasn't good enough," Sloane said. The wall came down eventually. It just took the whole rest of him with it. She hadn't meant to say it that plainly. 15 years of practiced silence, and here she was handing her grief to a stranger in a medical tent because he happened to have known her father in a life she'd never been allowed into. Cole didn't answer that right away, just sat there in the cold canvas quiet, letting it sit between them the way you let grief sit when there's nothing left to say that would actually help. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a generator coughed and steadied itself. A dog tag clinked against another dog tag, some soldier shifting in his sleep 2 tents over. The ordinary sounds of a camp that had no idea the ground under it had just shifted. "I need to ask you something," he said finally. "And I need you to understand I'm not asking because I don't believe you. I'm asking because if that tattoo is what Doc Alvarez thinks it is, some very serious people are going to want to talk to you before the sun comes up. And I would rather you hear the real question from me than get ambushed with it by someone in a suit who doesn't care whether you're still recovering from hypothermia." Sloane said. "Do you know what Project Night Watch was?" Cole said. "No," Sloane said, and it was the truth. And the truth felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and dark with no idea how far down it went. "But I think my father died trying to protect whatever it is. And I think somebody just found out I might be the only piece of it that's still alive." Outside the tent, an engine started, then another. The soft crunch of boots on snow moving with purpose, now moving like people who'd just received orders nobody had expected to give tonight. Cole's face changed. Whatever softness had been there a moment ago hardened into something more familiar to him, something built for exactly this kind of arrival. "That'll be them," he said quietly. "Whoever they are." Headlights swept across the canvas wall of the tent, twin blades of white light cutting through the dark, followed by the low, deliberate rumble of vehicles that had no business being able to reach this camp in weather like this. Which meant whoever was driving them didn't care about weather, didn't care about roads that technically didn't exist under 3 feet of snow. Cole stood, positioned himself without seeming to think about it between Sloane's cot and the tent flap. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Dr. Alvarez appeared in the opening a moment later, her face tight-lit, strange, and pale by the headlights behind her. She didn't say anything, just looked at Sloane, the way you look at someone standing on a train track who hasn't heard the whistle yet. Boots. Multiple sets. Snow crunching in a rhythm too even to belong to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to move that way. Then the tent flap peeled back and cold air rushed in ahead of 2 figures in black tactical gear that carried no insignia at all. No unit patch, no name tape. Nothing that would ever let anyone trace them back to an agency, a command, a country. The taller of the 2 studied the tent's interior for a long moment before his eyes settled on Sloane, like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. "Sloane Reeves," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice had the flat, practiced neutrality of a man who'd said 100 names exactly this way and never once let any of them hear what he actually thought. "Depends who's asking," Sloane said, because some stubborn piece of her father was still alive in her, apparently, and it had chosen this exact moment to speak up. The man's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "Somebody who's been looking for you for 15 years, he said. And somebody who's going to need you to come with us. Tonight. Cole didn't move from where he stood between them. She's not fit to travel, he said. Hypothermia, possible, concussion. She needs 48 hours minimum before anyone puts her on a transport. The man's eyes flicked to Cole, assessed him in half a second, and dismissed him just as fast. This isn't a discussion, Lieutenant. This comes from higher than anyone in this camp. I don't answer to whoever you answer to, Cole said. I answer to the fact that she's a civilian who bled for my team today. That buys her 48 hours in my book, whatever book you're reading from. The man studied Cole for a long moment. Something almost like respect flickered behind his eyes, gone as fast as it arrived. Careful, Lieutenant, he said quiet. Loyalty's a good look on you. It gets less useful once people above my pay grade start asking why you're standing between them and a matter of national security. Alvarez stepped forward before Cole could answer. That, her voice sharp with the particular authority doctors get to keep even in rooms full of men holding rifles. She has a Glasgow coma score I'm not comfortable clearing for transport, and a core temperature that only came back up 90 minutes ago. You want to move her against medical advice? You can put your name on that decision in writing. I'll make sure it follows you. The man's mouth flattened into a hard line. For the first time since he'd walked in, he looked less like a wall and more like a man doing math he didn't love the answer to. 6 hours, he said finally. Then we move. And I'll be sitting right outside this tent until we do. He turned and left without waiting for agreement, the second man following a half step behind, and the canvas flap fell shut behind them, cutting off the wind for exactly as long as it took Sloane's heart rate to remember how to slow down. Cole let out a breath he'd clearly been holding since the moment they walked in. 6 hours, he said. Not much of a war, but I'll take the win. Why did you do that? Sloane asked. You don't know me. Not really. One conversation and a debt to a man who's been dead 15 years doesn't obligate you to anything. Cole was quiet for a second, like he was deciding how honest to actually be. Your father obligated me to a lot more than a conversation, he said finally. And something tells me whatever's coming for you next, you're going to need somebody in your corner who isn't wearing a uniform with no name on it. So, consider me volunteered. Sloane felt the cold in her chest deepen, not from the wind now, not from the snow still crusted in her hair, but from something else entirely. Something that understood all at once that her old life, the cabin, the wood smoke, the 15 years of careful, deliberate forgetting had just ended in this tent. That whatever came next would be built on ground she'd never chosen to stand on. Where? She asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Somewhere you'll finally get some answers, the man said, about your father, about what he actually died protecting, and about why you're still wearing his last mistake carved into your skin. The wind screamed against the canvas walls, and Sloane Reeves, 27 years old, orphaned twice over, understood that the mountain hadn't buried her today. It had only just finished digging her out. 6 hours passed like 6 years. Sloane didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time her eyes closed, the avalanche came back white and roaring, and underneath it, quieter, worse, the memory of a needle sliding into her ribs at 11 years old, while her father held her hand and told her it was nothing. It was never nothing. She understood that now. Understood it the way you understand a wound only after someone finally shows you where it's been bleeding all along. She spent the hours running through everything she thought she knew about her father and finding one by one that most of it had holes in it she'd simply never had reason to look for. The trips that lasted 3 weeks and got explained in one sentence, the scar along his ribs he called an old training accident, the way he used to check the cabin's sightlines before he'd let himself relax into a chair, even on nights he swore the war was finally behind him. She thought about the year he'd taught her to shoot at 400 yards instead of 200. No explanation given, just a new set of drills added to the old ones, like it was the most natural progression in the world. She'd assumed at the time that he simply wanted her better prepared. Now she wondered whether some part of him had already known even then that 200 yards of safety margin might not be enough someday. that the war he kept trying to leave outside the cabin door had already found a way to circle back toward it. She'd thought that was just who he was. Now she wondered how much of it had been armor. How much had been a man building walls not to keep her out, but to keep something else from ever reaching her. At 0500, the tent flap opened and the man with no name tape was standing there again, exactly where he said he'd be, like he hadn't moved in 6 hours, like patience was just another muscle he'd trained past the point of strain. "Transport's ready," he said. No preamble, no apology for the hour. Cole was on his feet before Sloane had fully processed the sentence. "I'm coming with her." "That wasn't the arrangement," the man said. "It is now," Cole said. "You want to argue about it, argue with somebody who outranks me, otherwise I'm getting in that vehicle." The man looked at him for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, some math about which battles were worth fighting tonight. "Fine," he said, "but you're a guest, not a participant. You so much as breathe wrong in that briefing room, you're gone. Understood?" Cole said in a tone that suggested he understood nothing of the sort and intended to breathe however he pleased. Sloane almost laughed. Almost. The sound died somewhere in her throat, replaced by the cold, hard weight of what was actually happening. She was leaving her mountain. Leaving the cabin, the wood stove, the rifle she'd left leaning against a porch post that might already be buried under 6 feet of new snow. She hadn't chosen any of this. Except she thought that wasn't quite true either. She'd chosen it the second she picked up that rifle yesterday morning. Chosen it the second she decided a stranger's life mattered more than her own careful invisibility. You don't get to make a choice like that and then act surprised when the world shows up asking what else you're willing to choose. Cole sat beside her in the back seat, quiet for most of the ride until somewhere around the second checkpoint, he reached over and squeezed her hand, once brief, wordless, the kind of gesture that asked nothing and offered everything. "You don't have to talk," he said. "I just didn't want you sitting over there thinking you were doing this alone." "I've done everything alone for 15 years, she said. "It's sort of my whole personality at this point." "Yeah, well," he said, "personalities can update. Mine did back when a colonel I barely knew decided my life was worth more than his extraction window. Maybe it's your turn." She didn't answer, just let the words settle somewhere warm in her chest, a small ember against the cold that had taken up permanent residence there since the mountain. Outside the window, the last of the pines gave way to a stretch of fenced government land, gray and featureless under a sky just beginning to lighten toward morning. Sloane watched it slide past and wondered distantly if she'd ever look at a mountain again without hearing that low, enormous sound in her teeth, without her whole body bracing itself against snow that hadn't fallen yet. The facility didn't have a sign, didn't have a name anywhere visible, not on the gate, not on the badges the guards wore, not on anything. Just a squat concrete building tucked into a fold of mountains 2 hours south, ringed with fencing that hummed faintly with current cameras mounted at intervals too precise to be anything but deliberate. The drive there had been silent mostly. Cold beside her, in the back of a vehicle with blacked-out windows, the man with no name tape up front saying nothing. The kind of nothing that filled a space more completely than words could have. Sloane watched the mountain slide past through a 2-inch gap in the window shade, watched her whole life recede into a white blur she wasn't sure she'd ever get back to. They processed her like a package, badge photo, fingerprints, a blood draw she didn't consent to and wasn't asked to consent to, just told to hold still while a technician with cold hands found a vein. "Standard intake," the technician said when Sloane's face must have shown something. "Standard for what?" Sloane said. The technician didn't answer, which was by now exactly the answer she'd learned to expect. They put her in a room with no windows, a table, 2 chairs, a camera in the corner blinking its small red eye like it was keeping score. She waited 40 minutes before the door opened. 40 minutes is a long time when you have nothing but your own thoughts and a blinking red light for company. Long enough to run through every version of the last 24 hours and find new ways for each of them to hurt. Long enough to wonder if this was how her father spent his own waiting rooms, his own
windowless silences, learning to sit still while the walls closed in around whatever he wasn't allowed to say out loud. She thought about the cabin, about the wood stove, probably gone cold by now, about the rifle still leaning against a porch post, buried under fresh snow, about whether she'd ever see any of it again, or whether that life, the one she'd built stone by stone out of 5 years of solitude, had already become something she used to be instead of something she still was.
Stop, she told herself. Break it into pieces, one piece at a time. The door opened before she finished the thought. The woman who walked in wasn't what Sloane expected. No suit, no severe haircut, just a woman in her 60s, silver hair cropped short and practical, dressed like someone's favorite aunt, who happened to also carry herself like she'd once run rooms full of men twice her size into silence with a single sentence. "Director, Elaine Voss," she said, sitting down across from Sloane without offering a hand. "I ran Project Nightwatch until it was terminated. Or until I was told it was terminated, which turned out to be a different thing entirely." Sloane's pulse kicked up. "Then you knew him," she said. "My father." Voss's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Some old grief surfacing for just a second before she pushed it back down where it apparently lived most of the time. "I recruited him," Voss said. "Best operator I ever ran, sharpest mind, steadiest hands, and the single most stubborn man I've ever had the displeasure of trying to give orders to." "That sounds like him," Sloane said, and her throat tightened at how easily the sentence came out, like the muscle for talking about her father had just been waiting 15 years to be used again. Voss studied her for a long moment, and Sloane watched something shift in the older woman's face. Some old professional distance, struggling against a memory it couldn't quite hold back. "He talked about you know," Voss said. "Not often. Men in this line of work learn not to, but sometimes, late, after a debrief that had gone particularly badly, he'd mention his daughter up in Montana. Said you were the only good thing he'd built that the job hadn't gotten its hands on yet." Sloane's throat tightened around words she didn't have. "He was wrong," she said finally. "The job got its hands on me eventually. It just took 15 years to finish the job." "Do you know what Nightwatch actually was?" Voss asked, quiet now, gentler than before. "No," Sloane said. "Nobody's told me anything. Just that my father died protecting it, and that I'm apparently wearing some piece of it on my ribs that I don't remember agreeing to." Voss exhaled, long, slow. The exhale of someone about to say something she'd rehearsed and still didn't want to say out loud. "Nightwatch was an identification protocol," she said. "Built during the Cold War's final years and quietly kept alive long after everyone assumed programs like it had been shut down. The idea was simple. Certain operators, the ones running the deepest, most deniable missions, needed a failsafe, a way to be identified if they were ever captured, killed under false identity, or simply vanished so completely that no dental record or fingerprint database could bring them home. "A tattoo," Sloane said, quietly. "A biometric marker disguised as one Voss said. Coded to a specific individual, readable only by someone who knew what they were looking at. Your father had one. Every operator in the program had one." "Then why do I have one?" Sloane said, and her voice cracked right down the middle of the sentence, cracked in a way she hated, in a way that made her sound 11 years old again in that windowless clinic. Voss's face did something complicated, something that looked almost like guilt, wearing a stranger's clothes. "Because your father broke protocol," she said, "badly. He used your identity as a dead drop, encoded something into your marker that had nothing to do with your own identification and everything to do with protecting information he didn't trust anyone else to hold, not me, not command. Nobody." Sloane's mouth had gone dry. "What information? I don't know," Voss said. "That's the truth, whatever it's worth to you right now. I don't know. Nobody does. Whatever he hid in that code, he took the key to decrypting it with him when he died." "How is that possible?" Sloane said. "You ran the program. You're telling me a man under your command hid something inside his own daughter and you never once found out what it was?" Voss's expression tightened, not with anger, but with something closer to old, buried shame.
She looked for a moment like a woman doing arithmetic she'd been avoiding for a decade and a half, finally forced to carry the whole sum instead of just the parts she could live with. Because he stopped trusting the program 6 months before he died, she said. Stopped filing full reports, started requesting solo assignments he wouldn't explain even to me. I flagged it. I did. I sat him down myself and asked him what he thought he was protecting us from. He wouldn't tell me. Just said some things were safer the fewer people who understood them. I thought it was paranoia, burnout, the kind of thing operators get after enough years in the dark. I was wrong. He wasn't paranoid. He was right to be afraid, and I didn't listen closely enough to find out why until it was 15 years too late. The room went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Footsteps passed and faded. Then somebody found out Sloane said, slowly, working it out loud, working it out, the way her father taught her to work out any problem, piece by piece, refusing to look away from the ugliest part first. Somebody found out I exist. Found out what I'm carrying, and decided the easiest way to get it was to make sure I never made it off that mountain alive. Voss didn't confirm it, didn't need to. Her silence did the confirming for her. Who Sloane said? Who wants this badly enough to kill for it? That Voss said is exactly what I've spent the last 18 hours trying to determine. And I don't like any of the names showing up on my list. Voss stood gathering the tablet she'd brought in with her and paused at the door like there was something else she wanted to say and couldn't quite find the shape of it. I'm sorry, she said finally. For what it's worth, I'm sorry we didn't find you sooner. I'm sorry your father carried this alone for as long as he did. And I'm sorry that whatever piece you built for yourself up on that mountain is about to get taken apart piece by piece until we finish this. Then she was gone, and the windowless room swallowed the silence whole. Sloane sat there a long moment after the door clicked shut, hands flat on the table, breathing in a rhythm she had to consciously build, one inhale at a time, because the panic wanted in. She could feel it circling somewhere just behind her ribs, patient, waiting for a crack in her composure wide enough to slip through. Don't, she told herself. Not yet. Not here. Feel it later, somewhere safe, if safe is even a word that still applies to you. Except, there might not be a later. Except the last time she trusted a place to be safe, an avalanche had come looking for her specifically. Except every certainty she'd built her whole adult life around the cabin, the solitude, the careful architecture of a life designed to never again depend on anyone, had just been proven in the space of one conversation to be exactly as fragile as everything else her father had tried and failed to protect. She pressed her palms flat against the cold table and made herself breathe until the panic receded back to wherever it lived. They gave her a room with a bed and a door that locked from the outside, which told her everything about how this facility categorized her, whatever polite word they used out loud. Guest, asset, person of interest. All of them meant the same thing when the door only opened from one side. Cole found a way in anyway. Talked his way past a guard with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who'd spent a career getting into places he technically wasn't supposed to be. You look like hell, he said, dropping into the chair across from her bed. Thank you, she said. You look like you slept in a snowbank. I did, he said. Twice, actually, once on purpose. She almost smiled. The first real almost smile since the mountain. What did they tell you? She asked. Downstairs, in whatever version of this briefing they gave a guest who isn't supposed to breathe wrong. Cole's shoulders went rigid. Not much. Enough to know your father was running something so deep even half of command didn't know it existed. Enough to know somebody wants you dead badly enough to trigger an avalanche instead of just walking up and shooting you, which, for the record, is a genuinely deranged level of commitment to a kill. They wanted it to look natural, Sloane said. A mountain accident. Nobody investigates an avalanche. Except somebody did, Cole said, because you didn't die. And now they've got a much bigger problem than one dead hermit on a ridge.
They've got a live wire nobody can predict sitting in a government facility, asking questions nobody wants to answer. Sloane looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face steady, unbothered by any of this, in the particular way of a man who'd made peace with danger a long time ago, made the fear in her chest ease just slightly. Just enough to breathe around it.
I keep waiting to wake up, she admitted. Some part of me keeps expecting this is all still the avalanche, that I'm still under the snow somewhere and my brain built all of this because the alternative was too quiet to bear.
Cole leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a moment the easy humor dropped out of his voice entirely.
If this is a dream, he said, it's a genuinely terrible one. Mine, at least, usually has better coffee.
The joke landed soft, gentle, exactly calibrated to give her room to laugh without demanding she pretend everything was fine. She took it, let herself laugh, small and real. The first laugh she could remember since long before the mountain.
Why are you still here? She asked.
Really? You could have handed me off at intake and gone home to whatever life you had before yesterday. Cole was quiet for a second. Because your father pulled me out of a compound with 2 broken ribs and a gunshot wound nobody thought I'd survive, he said. Because he didn't have to come back for me. The mission was over. Extraction window had closed. He came back anyway. And I promised myself, lying in that hospital bed afterward, that if I ever got the chance to pay any part of that back, I would. This isn't the same thing, Sloane said. Isn't it? Cole said. Looks pretty similar to me. Somebody left behind, somebody who shouldn't have to face it alone. She didn't have an answer for that, just sat there letting the words land somewhere she hadn't let anything land in a very long time. He stayed another hour, didn't fill the silence with more words than it needed, just sat there present, solid, the kind of company that asked nothing of her except to exist in the same room. When he finally stood to leave, some part of her, some part she barely recognized after 15 years of only ever wanting to be left alone, wished he'd stay longer. The alarm came at 0300, not a fire alarm, something sharper. A 3-tone klaxon that made Cole's whole body go rigid before Sloane's sleep-fogged brain even registered what she was hearing. "Lockdown," he said, already moving, already pulling her off the bed. "That's a security breach. Somebody's inside the perimeter." The door, still locked from the outside, a moment ago buzzed and swung open on its own, some automated protocol releasing every door in the facility simultaneously. And Sloane understood, with the cold clarity of pure adrenaline, that whoever designed that protocol hadn't planned for a night like tonight. Cole grabbed her arm. "This way, command center, now!" They ran, the hallway strobed red alarm lights pulsing in a rhythm that made the whole corridor feel like it was breathing. Somewhere ahead, gunfire, controlled bursts, professional, the kind of shooting that meant trained men, not panicked intruders. A guard rounded the corner ahead of them, weapon up, and for one terrible half-second, Sloane's whole body braced for the shot. Then he recognized Cole's uniform and lowered his rifle, already turning to cover their flank instead. "East corridor's compromised," he shouted over the alarm. "Command wants everyone funneled through the west stairwell. Move, move, move!" They moved. Sloane's bare feet slapping cold concrete, Cole's hand never leaving her arm, steering her around a corner, just as something detonated somewhere behind them, close enough that the shockwave rattled the light fixtures overhead and sent a fine rain of ceiling dust sifting down through the strobing red light. "That was a breaching charge," Cole said, voice tight, controlled the voice of a man running calculations even while sprinting. "Which means whoever's in here didn't come to negotiate." Sloane's lungs burned, her bare feet numb against the concrete, and some distant, disbelieving part of her mind noted the strange symmetry of it, running for her life through a corridor instead of a snowfield, the same terror dressed in different weather. They found Voss in the command center, radio in hand, voice clipped and fast, directing security teams toward a breach point on the east perimeter. She looked up when they burst in, relief flashing across her face for exactly 1 second before something else replaced it. Something like dread. "Reeves," she said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." "What's happening?" Sloane said. "Someone got through our perimeter. using access credentials that shouldn't exist outside this building, Voss said, which means whoever's coming for you isn't operating blind, which means somebody inside this facility gave them exactly what they needed. The words landed like a physical blow. A mole. Someone inside, someone with clearance, someone who'd watched Sloane walk through intake yesterday and decided her life was worth less than whatever they were being paid or promised or threatened with. Who, Sloane said, and her voice had gone very flat, very calm, the calm that lives right on the other side of terror. I don't know yet, Voss said, but I intend to find out before the night's over. Cole's radio crackled, a voice, breathless, running. Breach contained, east side, 2 hostiles down, but command, we've got a problem. Whoever's coordinating this, they knew exactly where to hit. Knew the guard rotation, knew the blind spots in the camera coverage. This wasn't luck. A second voice cut in over the first, tighter, more urgent. We've got a third hostile unaccounted for. Last seen heading toward detention block B. That's where we're holding the 2 we already took down for questioning. Voss's face went pale under the harsh overhead light. They're not trying to extract information, she said, half to herself, half to the room. They're trying to make sure nobody talks. Get me eyes on detention block B, now. The radio erupted into overlapping voices, fast-clipped, professional, even under pressure, and Sloane watched a wall of monitors flicker as camera feeds cut between angles, hunting for a shape, moving through corridors it had no business moving through. There, someone said, and a grainy black and white feed froze on a figure in dark tactical gear, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew this building better than the people defending it. Voss's jaw set hard. Get me a list, she said into the radio, voice tight. Everyone who had access to tonight's rotation schedule. Everyone. I don't care how long you've worked with them or how many commendations they've got on the wall. I want every name. They found him an hour later. Sergeant Wade Holloway, 29 years old, communications specialist, 3 years with the unit, a service record clean enough to make him invisible in exactly the way a good mole needs to be invisible. Nobody watches the guy who's never given anyone a reason to watch him. He'd been the one who leaked the rotation schedule. The security footage confirmed it, grainy and damning Holloway at a terminal at 0140, transferring files to an external device. He then walked directly out to the perimeter fence and handed to someone in the tree line. Voss pulled his personnel file up on the same terminal, scrolling through years of commendations and clean evaluations that told a story completely at odds with the man on the security footage. No debt on record, no family trouble flagged in any review. Nothing that should have made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure that turns a decent soldier into somebody else's asset. That's what worries me most, Voss said half to herself. Whoever got to him did it quietly enough that 3 years of background checks never caught it. That's not luck. That's patience. Somebody's been building this for a long time. They brought him into an interrogation room down the hall from where Sloane and Cole waited, and even through reinforced walls, even muffled by distance, she could hear the shape of his voice, rising and falling, denial curdling slowly into something closer to confession. Cole sat beside her, arms crossed, a muscle working hard at the corner of his mouth like he was chewing on something he didn't trust himself to say out loud. I trained with him, he said. 6 months. Watched his back on 2 ops, and the whole time he was already somebody else's. You couldn't have known, Sloane said. That's what everyone says, Cole said. Doesn't make the knife feel any less real when it's already in your back. He was quiet a moment, staring at the wall like he could see straight through it to the room where Holloway was unraveling. You start doing this job, he said finally, and they teach you to trust your team with your life. Not sort of, not mostly. Completely. Because the second you hesitate, the second you wonder if the guy next to you has your back, that's the second you both die. So you build that trust, brick by brick, and you don't ever let yourself think about what happens if one of those bricks was rotten the whole time. And now you're thinking about it, Sloane said quietly. Now I'm thinking about it, he agreed, about every op we ran together, wondering what he told them, wondering how many of our close calls weren't actually close calls at all. They waited in silence for a while after that, the alarm lights finally dimming down to a steady amber glow, the corridor outside settling into the uneasy quiet of a building that had just survived something and hadn't yet decided how to feel about it. Through the wall, Holloway's voice cracked high in desperate words, dissolving into something Sloane couldn't make out but understood anyway. The particular sound of a man realizing every door he thought he had left has just quietly closed behind him. "They threatened my sister," she heard him say once, clear enough to carry and something twisted in her despite everything, despite the two men who might be dead right now because of what he'd done, despite the fact that she herself had been the target of whatever he'd set in motion, because she understood in some small, terrible way what it meant to have someone you loved used as leverage against everything you knew was right. "Doesn't make it right," Cole said, quietly, like he'd read the thought straight off her face. "But it might make it human." Doesn't mean it doesn't get punished, just means it's not as simple as some men wearing white hats and some wearing black ones. Voss came out of the interrogation room 40 minutes later, face drawn tight with an exhaustion that went deeper than the hour. "He's talking," she said. "Not everything, but enough." "Enough for what?" Sloane said. Voss sat down across from them, and for the first time since Sloane had met her, the director looked less like a woman in command of a crisis and more like a woman standing at the edge of one she hadn't fully accounted for. "Holloway was recruited 8 months ago," she said, "paid initially, then leveraged once they had enough on him to make refusal impossible. He doesn't know who he's actually working for, just a name, a cutout, somebody called Marsh." Sloane's whole body went very still. "Say that again?" she said. "Marsh Voss," repeated. "Why does that mean something to you?" Before Sloane could answer, Voss was already keying something into the terminal built into the command center's side console, pulling up a file that had clearly been sitting untouched in some archive for longer than Sloane had been an adult. "There's a photograph," Voss said, half to herself, scrolling through pages of scanned documents, mission logs, redacted so thoroughly they looked more black than white. "I remember it from the personnel file. Your father and the man who co-founded Night Watch with him. I need to see if I'm remembering the right face." The image resolved on the screen, grainy, 20 years old at least. Two men in fatigues, younger versions of themselves standing in front of a Humvee somewhere that could have been any desert on Earth, arms slung over each other's shoulders, in the easy, unguarded way of men who trusted each other with their lives and meant it. Sloane's chest went tight the second she saw it. Her father, younger, leaner, a smile on his face. She barely remembered him wearing by the time she was old enough to really know him. And beside him, unmistakable even 20 years younger, the man who used to sit at their kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, who used to bring her small gifts from whatever corner of the world his work had taken him to, who used to tell her every single time that if anything ever happened to her father, she'd never have to worry because he'd be there. "That's him," Sloane whispered. "That's Griffin Marsh." Voss's expression hardened into something Sloane hadn't seen on her yet. Not surprise, something colder. The look of someone confirming a fear she'd been quietly carrying since the moment Holloway said the name. "Marsh co-founded Night Watch with your father," she said. "Ran half the program himself back when it still had budget and backing. Then about 16 years ago, he was reassigned. Quietly. No scandal on paper, just a transfer to a liaison position that looked on the surface like a step sideways into obscurity. That's the year before my father died," Sloane said slowly. Voss nodded, once grim. "I never connected those dates before, tonight," she admitted. "I don't like that. I didn't. I don't like it at all." Sloane stared at the photograph a moment longer, at the version of Griffin Marsh who still had his whole arm slung easy over her father's shoulder, at the version of her father who still believed, apparently, that the man beside him would always be exactly what he appeared to be. "He used to bring me these little carved animals," she said, quiet, almost to herself, "from wherever he'd been. I had a whole shelf of them by the time I was 10. Elephants, a little wooden fox. I used to line them up on my windowsill and pretend they were guarding the house while my dad was gone."
Cole's hand found hers again, warm and sure, saying without words what neither of them was ready to put into speech yet.
I think Voss said carefully, we need to consider the possibility that Marsh's reassignment 16 years ago wasn't really a sideways step at all. I think it may have been the beginning of something he'd already decided to become. And I think your father may have started to suspect it in the months before he died, which would explain exactly why he chose to encode something into a marker only he controlled, instead of trusting it to the chain of command Marsh was still technically part of.
He didn't trust him anymore, Sloane said, but he still let him into our house. Still let him teach me to fish, still let him stand at my mother's funeral with his hand on my shoulder like he actually cared. Maybe he did care, Cole said quietly. Some of it. Doesn't make the rest of it less true. People aren't always all one thing, Sloane.
Sometimes the worst betrayals come from men who loved you exactly as much as they were capable of loving anyone, right up until the moment loving you stopped being convenient.
That should have made her feel better. It didn't. If anything, it made the whole thing worse. The idea that Griffin Marsh's affection for her all those summers, all those small kindnesses, might have been entirely real and entirely irrelevant to whatever calculation eventually decided her father needed to disappear.
Sloane didn't cry. She wanted to. Some old, exhausted part of her wanted to sit down right there on the cold floor of that command center and let 15 years of grief finally have its moment. But there wasn't room for it. Not yet. Grief was a luxury for later, for whenever later turned out to be, if later turned out to exist at all. Instead, she sat very still and let the pieces rearrange themselves into a shape she didn't want to see but couldn't stop seeing anyway. Somewhere underneath every summer fishing trip, every carved wooden animal, every birthday card that kept arriving even after her father stopped coming home, Griffin Marsh had been something else entirely. Something patient. Something waiting. Why, she said out loud, to no one in particular, to the room, to the ghost of her father who wasn't there to answer. Why would he do this? Cole's hand found her shoulder, didn't grip, just rested there warm and unmoving the way her father's hand used to rest there before every hard truth he was about to hand her. We're going to find out, he said. Together. Voss looked between them, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. There's something else, she said. Something Holloway said that I need you to hear because I think it changes the shape of everything we thought we understood about your father's death. Sloane's stomach dropped. Say it, she said. Voss took a breath. Your father wasn't killed by an enemy operation, she said. Holloway didn't know the details, just fragments, secondhand knowledge passed along a chain of people who each knew slightly more than the last. But the fragment he did know was this. The mission that killed Daniel Reeves wasn't sabotaged from outside. It was sabotaged from inside. Sloane finished, and the words came out of her like something breaking loose after 15 years of pressure. By someone who knew exactly where he'd be, exactly when, exactly how to make sure nobody came looking too hard afterward. By Marsh, she said. Voss didn't answer right away, but her silence again was answer enough. The op was supposed to be simple, Voss said finally, her voice gone quiet, almost apologetic, like she was confessing something she'd carried alone for 15 years without ever finding the right room to say it in. Extraction of an asset near the Canadian border. Low risk, on paper. Your father requested Marsh's team for backup because that's who you request when you've spent 20 years trusting a man with your life. The extraction point was supposed to be secured an hour before he arrived. It wasn't secured, Sloane said. It was empty. Empty, Voss confirmed. And by the time your father realized nobody was coming to cover him, it was already too late to get clear. Sloane felt something in her chest cave inward. Slow and total, like ice finally giving way after holding weight too long. He walked into a trap his best friend built for him, she said, and spent his last minutes on this earth thinking backup was coming. Voss didn't have an answer for that. Nobody could have.
Somewhere down the corridor, an alarm finally cut off the red lights, slowing, steadying the facility, settling back into an uneasy calm that felt more like held breath than actual safety. Sloane sat there in that borrowed quiet, 15 years of careful, deliberate forgetting collapsing all at once into a single, unbearable clarity. Her father hadn't died protecting a program from some faceless enemy. He'd died because the man he trusted most in the world had decided his life was worth less than whatever secret Daniel Reeves had been guarding. And now that same man wanted her dead too, not despite the fact that she was Daniel Reeves' daughter. Because of it. Voss left them alone eventually, called away to coordinate the cleanup of a breach that had, by the numbers coming in over the radio, killed 1 guard and wounded 3 others. All of it in service of a man Sloane had once trusted enough to call an uncle. She learned the dead guard's name before the night was through. Corporal Danny Osei, 26, 2 years on this rotation, a wife somewhere off base who didn't yet know she'd be getting a knock on her door before sunrise. Sloane hadn't known him, hadn't even seen his face, but the weight of it settled into her anyway. One more name added to the ledger. Griffin Marsh was going to have to answer for. The command center emptied out slowly, technicians and security staff drifting off toward whatever remained of the night until it was just Sloane and Cole sitting in the amber afterglow of alarm lights finally powering down. "You're quiet," Cole said. "I'm doing math," she said. "The kind my father taught me. Break the world into pieces. Look at each piece like it's the only one that matters." "And what piece are you looking at right now?" he asked. She turned to face him, and for the first time since the mountain, she let herself really look at him. Not as a soldier, not as a stranger who happened to owe her father a debt, just as a man who'd stayed hour after hour when nothing about this situation obligated him to. "The piece where I have to decide what kind of person I'm going to be now that I know the truth," she said. "My father spent his whole life building walls to keep the war away from me, and now the war's not just at my door, it's wearing the face of someone I loved. I could let that turn me into someone who only knows how to survive, or I could figure out how to still be someone worth surviving as." Cole was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something between admiration and something warmer, something that hadn't fully declared itself yet but was clearly getting close. "Your father would be proud of that answer," he said finally. "I only knew him a handful of years, and even I can hear him in it." "I hope so," she said, and her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "I've spent 15 years wondering if he'd even recognize the person I turned into up on that mountain. Half feral, talking to nobody, building a whole life around never letting anyone close enough to lose me the way I lost him." "You let me close," Cole said, quiet. Careful, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to say it out loud. "That surprised even me," she admitted, and something passed between them. Then something unspoken but entirely understood, the particular electricity of 2 people who'd been thrown together by violence and were slowly discovering it might have been the start of something neither one of them saw coming. "Get some sleep," Cole said, finally standing, breaking the moment before it could ask more of either of them than the night had room for. "Tomorrow we start figuring out how to find Griffin Marsh before he finds a second chance to finish what that avalanche started." He stopped at the door, looked back at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think you're half feral. I think you're the toughest person I've ever pulled out of a snowbank, and I've pulled a lot of people out of a lot of snowbanks." She managed a real smile this time, small, tired, real. "High praise," she said. "Highest I've got," he answered, and then he was gone, and Sloane sat alone in the quiet command center, the weight of everything Voss had told her settling slowly into a shape she could almost carry. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she'd start hunting the man who'd worn her family's trust like a disguise for 16 years. Tonight, for the first time since the mountain buried her, she let herself simply breathe. She sat alone in the amber quiet for a long time after that, longer than she meant to, watching the last of the alarm lights blink out one by one across the console, until the room settled into something almost like peace. Somewhere beyond these walls, Griffin Marsh was out there moving through whatever life he'd built on top of the lie he'd sold her family for 16 years, believing probably that the mountain had already finished his work for him. He didn't know yet that she'd survived, didn't know that a director with old guilt and a lieutenant with an old debt were already turning over every rock they could find to prove what he'd done. Didn't know that the girl he used to teach to fish on quiet Sunday afternoons had grown into a woman who could put 2 rounds on target at 600 yards through blowing snow, and who now had every reason in the world to aim that same steadiness at him. Somewhere out there he was probably sleeping soundly, untroubled, certain that a mountain had already cleaned up the one loose thread he'd never managed to tie off. He had no idea the thread had survived, had grown teeth, had spent the last 24 hours learning exactly how deep his betrayal went. Let him believe it a little longer, she thought. Let him sleep easy for one more night. Because tomorrow, the hunting started. And this time, she wasn't the one who'd be caught looking the wrong way when it mattered most. 3 days. That's how long it took to find Griffin Marsh's real location. 3 days of Voss's team pulling apart shell companies and cut-out accounts. 3 days of Sloane sitting in briefing rooms, learning the true shape of a man she'd once called family. 3 days of Cole, never leaving her side for more than an hour at a time, like he'd appointed himself something between bodyguard and anchor, and had no intention of resigning either post. She spent those 3 days learning things about Griffin Marsh that made her stomach turn every time a new file landed on the table. A private security empire built on government contracts. Board seats on companies that sold surveillance technology to anyone with a big enough checkbook. A foundation ironically named for veterans' welfare that seemed to exist mostly to launder money through tax-exempt donations nobody ever traced back to their real source. She slept in snatches those 3 nights when she slept at all, and every time she closed her eyes she saw some new fragment of him. Marsh, at the kitchen table laughing at something her father said. Marsh's hand on her shoulder at the funeral, steady where her own legs weren't. Marsh teaching her to cast a fishing line on a lake so still it looked painted, patient, in a way her father, always half a step ahead of the next mission, rarely had time to be. She'd spent 17 years building a version of him in her memory, and now she had 3 days to tear it down, piece by piece, and replace it with the truth. He built a kingdom, she said, on the 3rd morning, staring at a wall covered in printouts, red string connecting names and companies and dates in a pattern that looked less like an investigation and more like an accusation made visible, all of it standing on top of my father's grave. Voss studied the wall alongside her, arms crossed, exhaustion carved deep into her face after 3 sleepless nights. Men like Marsh don't see graves, she said quietly. They see foundations. It's the only way someone builds something like this without the weight of it crushing them first. He's not hiding, Voss added on the morning of the 3rd day, sliding a folder across the table. That's what makes this hard. He's operating in plain sight, runs a private security contracting firm out of Colorado Springs, government contracts, congressional testimony twice in the last 5 years on domestic threat assessment. The man built himself a legitimate empire on top of everything he destroyed to get there. Sloane opened the folder. A photograph stared back at her. Older now. Silver at the temples where there used to be brown. The same easy, disarming smile she remembered from 1,000 Sunday dinners. He looks exactly the same, she said quietly. That's the part I can't get past. 15 years and he still looks like somebody's favorite uncle. Monsters usually do, Cole said. That's sort of the whole trick. Voss tapped the folder. His company's hosting a gala Friday night. Donors, contractors, a few senators. High visibility, which means high security, but also means he can't risk a scene. Whatever happens between you and him, it happens in a room full of witnesses who all think he's exactly who he says he is. You want to send me into a room alone with him? Sloane said. I want to give you a choice nobody gave your father, Voss said. He never got the chance to look Marsh in the eye and ask why. You do. Cole leaned forward, elbows on the table, arms crossed tight in the way they always got when he was holding back an objection out of respect rather than agreement. "I don't love this plan," he said, "for the record. Too many variables, too many ways it goes sideways in a room full of people we can't fully control." "Noted," Voss said. "And overruled, unless Sloane says otherwise. This is her call to make, nobody else's." Sloane looked between them, feeling the weight of the decision settle onto her shoulders, the way her father's old rifle used to settle there. Familiar, despite the danger. A burden she'd carried before and somehow always found the strength to carry again.
"I'll do it," she said. 15 years of silence? I think I've earned one conversation where I finally get to ask the question out loud.
"Then we start prepping tonight," Voss said, already reaching for the next folder on the stack. The gown felt wrong on her, too smooth, too light, nothing like the layered wool and thermal fabric that had kept her alive on a mountain for 5 years. Sloane stood in front of a hotel mirror in Colorado Springs and barely recognized the woman looking back. Because that woman had makeup on. Had her hair swept up off her neck in a way that made her feel exposed in a completely different manner than a firefight ever had. Because that woman looked, for the first time in 15 years, like someone who belonged in a room full of powerful people instead of someone who'd spent half a decade actively avoiding every single one of them. She thought about her mother briefly, standing in front of a mirror, much like this one, getting ready for some Navy function decades ago, laughing about a dress that wouldn't zip. The memory arrived unbidden and left just as fast, too fragile to hold on to for long without unraveling something else along with it. "You clean up alarming well," Cole said from the doorway, adjusting his own tie with the particular discomfort of a man who felt more at home in tactical gear than anything with a collar.
"Don't get used to it," she said. "This is a one-night engagement."
He crossed the room and something in his expression sobered fast, all traces of the joke gone. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We could still pull the plug. Let Voss build the case some other way. Let this be somebody else's fight." "It's not somebody else's fight," Sloane said. "It never was. It's mine. It's been mine since I was 11 years old and didn't even know it." Cole studied her for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to settle something in him. "Okay," he said quietly. "Then let's go find out what he has to say for himself." She reached for the small clutch on the bed, the one with the radio mic sewn into the lining, and a tracker Voss's team would monitor from a van 3 blocks away, and felt her hands shake for the first time since the mountain. Because this wasn't a firefight. Firefights, she understood. This was walking into a room and smiling at the man who'd killed her father, and doing it well enough that he never saw the knife coming until it was already too late to matter. The ballroom glittered like something out of a life she'd never been meant to have. Chandeliers throwing gold light across marble floors, a string quartet playing something she didn't recognize. Men in tuxedos, women in gowns that cost more than she'd spent on groceries in the last 3 years combined, all of it wrapped around a man standing near the center of the room, like gravity itself bent slightly in his direction. Sloane stood at the edge of it for a moment, feeling Cole's presence a careful 10 feet away, close enough to reach her in seconds, far enough to look to anyone watching like two strangers who'd simply arrived at the same event. Somewhere outside, in a nondescript van 3 blocks away, Voss and her team were listening to every word this room produced, waiting for a signal Sloane hoped she'd have the nerve to give. Griffin Marsh hadn't changed the way she remembered him changing in her nightmares. He'd changed the way people change when nothing ever catches up to them. Silver hair, a tailored suit that fit like it had been poured onto him, and that smile. God, that same warm, easy smile that used to make her feel safe as a child now, sitting on his face like a mask he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it wasn't his real one. She watched him work the room, watched him laugh at something a senator said, watched him clasp a donor's hand with both of his own in that particular gesture that always made people feel like the most important person he'd spoken to all night. Then his eyes found her across the room and stopped. She watched recognition move across his face in real time, watched shock give way to something more complicated, something that flickered between fear and
Absurdly, something that almost looked like joy. "Sloane," he said when he reached her, his voice pitched low, private, meant only for her. "My God, Sloane Reeves. I heard you'd been in some kind of accident. I actually heard you didn't make it." "You heard wrong," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to feel, with her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough that she was sure he could see it. Something crossed his face. Gone in half a second, but she caught it. Recalculation. The look of a man discovering the ground under him wasn't quite where he'd left it. "You look incredible," he said, recovering, sliding back into the warmth like a coat he'd never taken off. "It's been, 6 years? 7? I think about your father every day, you know. Best man I ever served with." The words landed like acid. "Is that what you tell yourself?" she said quietly. "Every day? Is that the story that lets you sleep at night?" His smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very still, very careful. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "I think you do," Sloane said. "I know about the extraction point, Griffin. I know it was supposed to be secured an hour before he arrived. I know it wasn't. I know he spent his last minutes on this earth waiting for backup that you made sure never came." The room around them kept moving, kept glittering, kept laughing at jokes and sipping champagne, utterly oblivious to the fact that 15 years of buried truth had just detonated quietly in its center. Marsh's jaw tightened, just slightly. Just enough. "You should be careful making accusations like that," he said, voice still low, still pleasant on the surface, but something underneath it had gone hard as steel. "Especially somewhere this public. People might start wondering what kind of trauma made a woman start seeing conspiracies in old friends." "That's clever," she said. "Almost admirable, actually." Turning it around on me before I've even finished the sentence. "Is that what you did to him too? Right before you left him to die? Made him feel crazy for trusting his own instincts?" Something flickered across Marsh's face then, fast, ugly, gone almost as soon as it appeared. But she'd seen it. The mask slipping just for a heartbeat, revealing something colder underneath. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "There's a terrace, fewer ears." The terrace overlooked the mountains, dark shapes against a sky scattered with stars, close enough that Sloane could almost pretend for one absurd moment that she was standing on her own porch instead of a stranger's gala. Marsh closed the door behind them, muting the music and laughter to a distant hum. "You have no idea what you're accusing me of," he said, and the warmth was gone now, entirely replaced by something flatter, something that had been waiting 15 years for exactly this conversation. "Then tell me," she said. "Make me understand. Because right now all I have is a father who trusted you with his life and a dead man's daughter standing on a mountain who nearly ended up the same way he did." Marsh's hands, she noticed, had gone very still on the terrace railing. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, older, a register she recognized from childhood, from late nights when the adults thought she was asleep and let their guards down around the kitchen table. "You want to know what it's like?" he said, "spending 20 years building something with a man you'd die for, and then watching him decide one afternoon that everything you'd built together wasn't worth adapting to survive?" "That's not an answer," Sloane said. "That's a justification. There's a difference." "Is there?" he said. "From where I'm standing, every great betrayal in history started as somebody's very reasonable justification." "Night Watch was dying," he said finally. "Bleeding budget, bleeding relevance. Your father wanted to keep fighting a war that half of Washington had already decided wasn't worth funding anymore. I saw where it was headed. I saw an opportunity to build something that would actually survive, something with real resources, real reach." "At the cost of his life," Sloane said. "At the cost of one man who refused to see the future clearly," Marsh said. And there it was, finally, the ugly truth stepping fully out of its expensive suit. "I offered him a place in what I was building. Begged him, honestly. Told him the old ways were finished, that men like us needed to evolve or get left behind with the rest of the relics nobody remembered to thank. He said no. Said I'd stopped being the man he trusted. Said he'd report everything he suspected the moment he got back from that extraction.
So you made sure he never got back, Sloane said, and her voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous. Marsh looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression, for just a second, looked almost like grief. I loved your father, he said. That part was never a lie. But loving someone doesn't mean you let them destroy everything you've built because they can't adapt to a changing world. You didn't just destroy his career, Sloane said. You murdered him. And then you spent 15 years playing uncle to the daughter he left behind, teaching me to fish, sitting at my mother's funeral, letting me believe you were family, while you were quietly hunting for whatever he'd hidden inside me to make sure I'd never be able to prove any of it. Marsh's expression hardened completely now, the mask gone for good. I gave you every chance to disappear quietly, he said. That mountain should have swallowed you the way it was supposed to. Instead, you climbed out, and now you've made yourself a problem I have to solve properly this time. Behind her, the terrace door opened. Cole stepped through it, tuxedo jacket already discarded somewhere, sidearm drawn and steady, and for the first time all night, Griffin Marsh's careful composure actually cracked. Step away from her, Cole said, voice flat. Final. Marsh's eyes flicked between them, calculating the way a cornered man calculates looking for an angle that didn't exist. Lieutenant Cole, he said. I remember you. Your extraction, if I recall, was a close one. Closer than it should have been, Cole said. Funny how that keeps happening around you. Marsh's hand moved fast toward the inside of his jacket, and Sloane's whole body reacted before her mind finished processing the threat. Years of training igniting in an instant, closing the distance and driving her palm hard into his wrist before the weapon could clear its holster. The pistol clattered across the terrace stone. Marsh staggered back, more surprised than hurt, and for one suspended second nobody moved. Then he shouted a single word into the night. Sharp, commanding. A word that meant nothing to Sloane and everything to the two men who came through the terrace's side entrance a heartbeat later, both of them in the black suits of private security, both of them already reaching for concealed weapons of their own. Cole moved first, faster than Sloane's eyes could fully track, closing on the nearest guard and driving him back into a stone pillar, hard enough to crack the man's composure, along with, probably, a rib. The second guard swung toward Sloane, and every instinct her father had ever drilled into her over a lifetime of quiet Sunday mornings on that mountain came roaring up at once. She dropped low, let his first strike sail over her shoulder and drove her elbow up into his jaw with everything her legs could give it. He staggered. She didn't let him recover, sweeping his leg out from under him and following him down onto the terrace stone with a knee that ended the fight before it had properly started. Somewhere behind her, Cole finished his own guard with a short, brutal economy of motion that spoke of 100 training rooms and at least a few real ones, and then the terrace, for one strange, ringing moment, went quiet. Marsh, alone now, weaponless, stared at the two of them like a man watching his last available option evaporate in real time. Sloane looked down at him, and for one long, terrible second she understood exactly how easy it would be. One motion. One choice her father's training had prepared her to make 100 times over in situations far less personal than this one. Nobody on this terrace would blame her. Some part of her, the part still 11 years old in a windowless clinic, still 12 years old watching two men in dress uniforms walk up a porch, wanted nothing more than to make him disappear the same way he'd made her father disappear. Except that wasn't justice. That was just more of the same violence dressed up as an ending. And her father hadn't died so she could become the kind of person who solved every betrayal with a body on the ground. She let the thought pass through her like weather. Let it come, let it burn, let it go. Run, Sloane said quietly, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, something that made the offer worse than any threat could have. Go on. See how far you get. I promise you it won't be far enough. He didn't run. Something in him, some last surviving fragment of the man who used to teach a little girl to cast a fishing line, seemed to understand there was no version of tonight that ended any other way. Voss's voice crackled through the earpiece hidden beneath Sloane's hair, calm, urgent. "We have everything. The confession is on record. Security's moving in now. Do not let him leave that terrace." Marsh heard it too, some ghost of the transmission bleeding through the quiet night air, and something in his face finally, completely collapsed. "It's over," Griffin Sloane said, and 15 years of grief and fury and love twisted together into a single steady sentence. "You don't get to disappear into some other identity the way you helped erase my father. You're going to stand trial. You're going to say his name out loud in a courtroom and explain to the whole world exactly what you did to him." Marsh looked at her for a long, silent moment, something breaking behind his eyes, some final collapse of the man who used to carve small wooden animals for a little girl who trusted him completely. "He was my brother," he said quietly, "in every way that mattered except blood, and God help me, I still don't know if I'd do anything differently." "Then you're worse than I thought," Sloane said, "because at least a monster who doesn't know better is just broken. You knew exactly what you were choosing, and you chose it anyway." Security flooded the terrace a moment later, real security this time, badges and radios, and the controlled chaos of a takedown finally executed properly, and Sloane stepped back, let them do their work. Let 15 years of careful hunting finally close its hand around the man who'd built an empire on her father's grave. Cole appeared at her side, breathing hard, a thin line of blood at his temple from where the first guard's ring had caught him. "You're hurt," she said. "I've had worse from a bar fight," he said. "You okay?" She looked down at her own hands, still trembling faintly, adrenaline draining out of her system in slow, uneven waves. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Ask me again once it's finished sinking in." They stood together at the terrace railing while agents led Griffin Marsh away in handcuffs past the same gilded ballroom he'd charmed 20 minutes earlier, past donors and senators who would spend the rest of the night whispering about a scandal none of them yet understood the full shape of. He didn't look back at her. Sloane wasn't sure whether that was mercy or cowardice, and decided watching him go that it didn't matter which. Voss called 2 weeks later, her voice carrying an urgency Sloane hadn't heard from her since the night of the breach. "We finally cracked it," she said. "The code. Whatever your father hid in that marker 15 years ago." Sloane sat down hard on the edge of her hotel bed, phone pressed tight against her ear. Cole, watching her face from across the room, already reading the shift in her posture. "Tell me," Sloane said. "It wasn't a secret weapon," Voss said. "Wasn't classified troop movements or some grand conspiracy. It was a ledger. Account numbers, dates, transaction records, all of it, tracing Marsh's earliest thefts from Nightwatch's own budget, going back nearly 18 years. Your father found it almost 2 years before he died. Started building a case quietly on his own because he didn't trust anyone left in the chain of command not to bury it the moment Marsh caught wind. He was protecting the evidence," Sloane said slowly, the pieces settling into place with a kind of aching clarity. "Not some secret program, just proof. Proof that the man everyone trusted was already stealing from the people he served with. He didn't have anyone else he trusted enough to hold it." Voss said, "Quiet now. So he hid it inside the one person he trusted more than anyone alive. He just never got the chance to tell you what you were carrying or why." Sloane sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle inside her that had been unsettled for 15 years. Not vengeance, exactly. Something closer to completion. Her father hadn't died guarding some vast, unknowable secret. He'd died trying to protect the truth in the most literal sense, and had trusted his own daughter to be the safest place in the world to keep it. "He knew you'd come through," she said, half to herself, half to Voss, half to the ghost of a man who'd carried this alone for 2 years without ever once letting her see the weight of it. "Even though he never told me, he knew somehow that I'd be strong enough to finish what he started. That evidence," Voss said, "is what convicted Marsh in the end. More than Holloway. More than the confession you recorded on that terrace. Your father built the case himself years before either of us knew to look for it.
He just needed someone to finally open the file. There's one more piece, Voss added, quieter now. The men on that ridge, the ones who ambushed Cole's team the day you fired those first 2 shots? Sloane's stomach tightened. Tell me. They weren't random, Voss said. They were Marsh's contractors. Cole's team had stumbled onto one of his black market weapons shipments during a routine patrol, purely by accident. No idea whose operation they'd walked into. Marsh gave the order to eliminate them, rather than risk the exposure. You just happened to be the one person on that mountain who could shoot straight enough to stop it. Sloane closed her eyes, the pieces finally locking into a shape that made a terrible kind of sense. So the avalanche wasn't random either. No, Voss said. Once his men reported a shooter with that kind of precision working alone from that exact stretch of the Bitterroot Marsh made the connection almost immediately. Nobody shoots like that except someone Daniel Reeves trained personally. He didn't know for certain it was you, but he couldn't afford to be wrong. So he buried the whole mountain to make sure. He tried to kill me twice in one afternoon, Sloane said, and the words came out flat, almost disbelieving before they left any evidence. And failed twice, Cole said quietly from across the room. That's not nothing. After she hung up, Sloane sat in the quiet hotel room for a long while, phone still warm in her hand, until Cole crossed the room and sat down beside her without asking what she needed first. He wasn't protecting some grand secret, she told him finally. He was protecting the truth. That's all it ever was, a ledger. Numbers on a page that somebody didn't want anyone to see. Sometimes that's the most dangerous thing in the world, Cole said quietly. The truth written down somewhere it can't be argued with. She leaned into him then, just slightly, just enough, and felt him steady around her the way the mountain used to. Solid and unmoving and exactly where she needed it to be. The trial took 4 months. Sloane sat through every single day of it in the back row, cold beside her every time, watching Griffin Marsh's careful practiced charm slowly crumble under the weight of evidence Voss's team had spent months assembling. Financial records, communications intercepts, 2 former associates who'd finally decided their consciences outweighed their fear. She took the stand on the 12th day, stood in front of a jury of 12 strangers and told them about a shelf of small carved animals, about a man who taught her to fish, about a needle in a windowless clinic when she was 11 years old and too trusting to understand what was being hidden inside her. She watched the jury's faces while she talked, watched sympathy and anger move across them in equal measure, and understood somewhere in the middle of her own testimony that she was finally doing the one thing her father never got the chance to do. Telling the truth out loud in a room where it mattered. Marsh's lawyers tried everything, painted her as traumatized, unreliable a woman whose isolation on a mountain for 5 years had left her vulnerable to elaborate delusions about a family friend. She let them try. Let the prosecution dismantle every version of that story with documents Marsh himself had signed, transactions Marsh himself had authorized, a paper trail 15 years deep that no amount of charisma could talk its way around. Cole testified too on the 19th day, steady and unshakable under cross-examination, in a way that made Sloane, watching from the gallery, understand all over again exactly why her father had trusted him enough to come back for him under fire. Voss testified on the 22nd, laying out 15 years of institutional blindness with a candor that cost her career and, judging by the set of her jaw the whole time she spoke, that she'd decided was worth paying without a second thought. Even Wade Holloway took the stand, thinner than Sloane remembered him from that first terrible night, his voice cracking through an account of coercion and threat that painted Marsh not just as a killer, but as a man who built his empire on the desperation of people with nowhere else to turn. The verdict, when it came, felt strangely quiet. No fireworks, no sense of triumph, just a courtroom full of exhausted people finally hearing a judge say the word guilty, and a 15-year weight lifting off Sloane's chest so slowly she almost didn't notice it was gone until she tried to breathe and found there was suddenly room for it. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions she didn't answer. Cole's hand found hers, familiar now in a way that felt less like comfort and more like home. You did it, he said quietly. We did it, she corrected. I wouldn't have made it through any of this without you standing next to me. He smiled, small and tired and real. That's the thing about promises, he said. Once you make one to a man like your father, you don't get to half keep it. Voss found them on the courthouse steps a few minutes later, the crowd of reporters finally thinning as the afternoon light softened toward evening. Night watch is being formally decommissioned, she said. For real this time. No more shadow budget, no more secrets kept from the people who ought to have known. Your father's file is being unsealed, full honors, a proper accounting of everything he actually did for this country, instead of the silence he got instead. Sloane felt something in her chest loosen at that. Some final knot she hadn't realized was still holding 15 years of grief in place. He would have hated the fuss, she said, and something like a laugh escaped her, small and surprised, the first one that had felt entirely unguarded in longer than she could remember. Then it's a good thing he's not here to complain about it, Voss said, something almost fond in her voice now. The careful, professional distance she'd carried since the night in that medical tent, finally, quietly giving way to something warmer. Go home, Sloane. Take some time. You've earned more than most people ever will. They held the ceremony on a gray Tuesday morning in March at a national cemetery outside Washington that Sloane had never once visited in 15 years, because visiting would have meant admitting there was a grave to visit, a marker with a date on it that closed a door she'd spent her whole adult life refusing to shut. More people came than she expected. Men she'd never met, weathered and quiet, introducing themselves in low voices as operators her father had trained, men whose lives had been shaped by his patience and his stubbornness in ways they'd carried with them for decades. One of them, gray-haired and leaning on a cane, told her he owed her father his life twice over, and that he'd spent 15 years wishing he'd had the chance to say so. He talked about you, too, the man added, watching her face carefully. Said his daughter was the toughest person he ever trained. Didn't think any of us believed him. Looks like he was right all along. A folded flag, a rifle volley that made her flinch despite every year of training that should have made the sound familiar instead of raw. Voss stood on one side of her, Cole on the other, and for the first time since she was 12 years old, Sloane let herself cry in front of other people. Let the grief finally have the moment it had been owed for 15 long years. Colonel Daniel Reeves, the officer reading the citation said, gave his life in service to his country in an operation whose full details remain even now only partially declassified. What is known is this. He identified a threat from within his own ranks, and rather than compromise the integrity of the mission or the safety of those he served with, he chose to protect the truth at the cost of his own life. It wasn't the whole story. Sloane understood that some parts of it never would be, not fully, not in any official record the government was willing to release. But it was true as far as it went, and after 15 years of nothing at all true and partial felt like an ocean compared to the silence she'd been drowning in. She accepted the flag with steady hands, the same hands that had once fit a rifle stock her father shaped just for her, and held it against her chest the way she imagined somewhere some part of him might have wanted to be held one final time. Rest now, she whispered so quiet only the wind could have carried it anywhere. You did enough. More than enough. Let me carry the rest. Afterward, walking back through rows of white markers stretching farther than she could comfortably look at, Sloane understood something she hadn't expected to understand today. Every one of these stones belonged to somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody left standing at a window years later watching a tree line, waiting for an answer that might never come. Her grief wasn't smaller for being shared this widely. If anything, it felt larger and lighter, both at once. The particular relief of finally setting something down among people who understood exactly how heavy it had been to carry alone. Spring came late to the Bitterroot that year. Sloane stood on her porch in April watching the last stubborn patches of snow surrender to sun-warmed earth, watching green push up through ground that had been frozen solid the last time she stood in this exact spot. The cabin needed work. The roof had taken damage over a winter she hadn't been there to maintain it through. The wood pile was gone, scavenged by something wild during her long absence, but the bones of it were still good, still hers. She spent the first 2 days simply walking the property, reacquainting herself with a life she'd built to survive on and had somehow, without meaning to, turned into a life worth actually living. The creek behind the cabin, swollen with snowmelt, singing over stones the way it always did this time of year. The old porch swing her father had built the summer before he died, still hanging, weathered but sturdy from the beam he'd anchored it to 20 years ago. She sat in it for an hour on the second evening, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the mountain hold her the way it always had before she understood what it had actually been protecting her from. She found her rifle exactly where she'd left it, buried under a season of snow but otherwise untouched, and spent an afternoon cleaning it on the porch, oiling the bolt, running a cloth along the stock her father had shaped for hands smaller than his own. It felt different in her grip now. Steadier, maybe, just less like a wall and more like a tool she'd chosen to keep rather than a habit she couldn't put down. She'd come back alone. Told Cole she needed this part for herself, this first return to the mountain that had tried to bury her, and instead had ended up delivering her into a truth she'd spent 15 years running from. She walked to the tree line where she'd first spotted the SEAL team all those months ago and stood there a long moment, letting the memory move through her without flinching away from it. The gunfire, the avalanche, the cold, crushing dark that had almost been the end of everything. Instead, it had been the beginning. She thought about the girl she'd been before that day. Careful, closed, certain that the only way to survive loss was to make sure nothing else ever got close enough to be lost again. That girl had been strong in her own narrow way. But she'd also been half-buried long before any avalanche found her sealed inside a grief she'd never let herself fully feel because feeling it meant admitting how much she'd actually lost. The woman standing in this clearing now felt different. Not lighter, exactly. The grief hadn't disappeared. It had simply stopped being the only thing she was made of. She dug a small hole at the base of an old lodgepole pine, the same one that had stood witness to everything that started here, and set her father's dog tags inside it, wrapped in a strip of cloth she'd cut from his old field jacket years ago, and never told anyone she'd kept. Beside the tags, she placed one more thing. A small wooden fox, worn smooth from handling the last of the carved animals Griffin Marsh had ever given her. The one she'd kept on her windowsill for 17 years without ever once questioning where it came from or what it might have cost her to keep loving the man who'd carved it. She wasn't burying her father today. She understood that kneeling there in the cool spring dirt, she was burying the last, soft, unguarded part of her childhood that had trusted Griffin Marsh completely. The part that still, somewhere, underneath everything else, mourned the uncle she'd believed him to be, as much as it hated the man he'd actually become. Both things were true. She'd finally stopped needing them not to be. "I finally know Dad," she said, quiet to the wind, to the mountain, to whatever part of him might still be listening somewhere in all this cold, clean air. "I know what happened. I know who did it, and I made him answer for it. I hope wherever you are, that's enough. I'm not the girl you left on this mountain anymore," she added, and her voice caught just slightly on the last words. "I don't know if that's a good thing or a hard thing, maybe both, but I think you'd be proud of who I turned into either way." The wind picked up, rustling through pine needles in a sound that had always, her whole life, felt like the mountain breathing. She covered the small hole, patted the earth flat, and stood. Behind her, gravel crunched under tires, an engine cutting off somewhere down the drive she still hadn't fully cleared of winter debris. She turned, and Cole was climbing out of a truck that had clearly seen better decades, 2 coffees balanced in a cardboard tray, an expression on his face like a man who wasn't entirely sure of his welcome but had decided to risk it anyway. "You said you needed to do this alone," he said. "I did," she said. "I'm done now." He climbed the porch steps, handed her a coffee, black, no sugar, exactly the way she took it, and she wondered briefly when he'd learned that detail without her ever telling him. "I wasn't going to come," he admitted, settling onto the top step beside her. Figured you meant it when you said alone.
Then I got about as far as the county line and turned the truck around because some part of me couldn't shake the feeling that alone wasn't actually what you needed today. Just company that knew when to keep its mouth shut. That's oddly perceptive for a man who talks as much as you do, she said.
I contain multitudes, he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched toward a smile he didn't quite let all the way out. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, coffee steaming in the cool spring air, the creek singing somewhere behind the cabin, the whole mountain settling into the particular hush of late afternoon. "What happens now?" he asked eventually. She looked out at the mountain, at the tree line, at the whole enormous, complicated, healing landscape of her life stretched out in front of her. "Now," she said, "I think I finally get to find out who I am when I'm not just surviving something." Cole leaned against the porch rail beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, comfortable in a silence that no longer felt like the isolation she'd spent 5 years building. "I've got some time coming," he said, careful, like he was testing the weight of the words before he committed to them fully. "Been thinking about how I might spend it. This mountain's not a bad place to figure that out if the person who lives here doesn't mind the company." Sloane looked at him for a long moment, at the quiet, unshakable warmth that had never once wavered since the night he pulled her out of a snowbank and refused to leave her side, and felt something in her chest open that had been closed for longer than she could accurately measure anymore. "I think," she said slowly, "the mountain's decided it likes you. And I've learned not to argue with this mountain." "Sounds like a good place to start," he said. The wind moved through the trees. The sun climbed higher over ridgelines that had once tried to kill her, and instead had given her back everything she thought the mountain had taken 15 years ago. Somewhere below, the creek kept singing over stones it had worn smooth across 100 years of spring thaws, patient in the way only rivers and mountains and grief itself ever really are, wearing everything down eventually into something softer than it started out being. Sloane thought about the girl on the ridge, 600 yards from a stranger's life, deciding in half a heartbeat that it mattered more than her own careful invisibility. Thought about the woman she'd become in the months since the courtrooms and the confessions and the terrace where 15 years of silence had finally broken open into truth. Thought about her father, carrying a secret alone because he trusted no one else to be strong enough to hold it, and how right he'd turned out to be, even if it had taken her this long to prove it. For the first time since she was 12 years old, standing on a different porch watching 2 men in dress uniforms walk toward a truth she wasn't ready for, Sloane Reeves felt something that had nothing to do with survival. She felt simply peaceful. And for now, that was enough.